Chapter 14, Part 1 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post. Chapter 14, Part 1, Formal Dinners. Not for the novice to attempt. If the great world of society were a university, which issued degrees to those whom it trains to its usages, the magna cum laude honours would be awarded without question, not to the hostess who may have given the most marvellous ball of the decade, but to her who knows best every component detail of preparation and service, no less than any inexorable rule of etiquette in formal dinner-giving. To give a perfect dinner of ceremony is the supreme accomplishment of a hostess. It means not alone perfection of furnishing, of service, of culinary skill, but also of personal charm, of tact. The only other occasion when a hostess must have equal, and possibly even greater ability, is the large and somewhat formal week-end party, which includes a dinner or two as by no means its least formidable features. There are so many aspects to be considered in dinner-giving that it is difficult to know whether to begin upstairs or down, or with furnishing, or service, or people or manners. One thing is certain, no novice should ever begin her social career by attempting a formal dinner, any more than a pupil swimmer, upon being able to take 3 strokes alone, should attempt to swim 3 miles out to sea. The former will as surely drown as the latter. How a dinner is given in a great house. When Mrs. Worldly gives a dinner, it means no effort on her part whatsoever beyond deciding upon the date and the principal guests who are to form the nucleus. Every further detail is left to her subordinates, even to the completion of her list of guests. For instance, she decides that she will have an older dinner, and finding that the 10th is available for herself, she tells her secretary to send out invitations for that date. She does not have especial cards engraved, but uses the dinner blank described in the chapter on invitations. She then looks through her dinner list, and orders her secretary to invite the old worlds, the eminents, the learneds, the wellborns, the highbrows, and the once-weres. She also picks out 3 or 4 additional names to be substituted for those who regret. Then turning to the younger married list, she searches for a few suitable but amusing or good-looking ones to give life to her dinner which might otherwise be heavy. But her favourites do not seem appropriate. It will not do to ask the Bobo Gildings, not because of the difference in age, but because Lucy Gilding smokes like a furnace, and is miserable unless she can play bridge for high stakes, and, just as soon as she can bolt through dinner, sit at a card-table, while Mrs. Highbrow and Mrs. Once-Were quite possibly disapprove of women smoking, and are surely horrified at gambling. The Smartlings won't do either for the same reason, nor the Gayleys. She can't ask the Newell Riches either, because Mrs. Oldworld and Mrs. Wellborn both dislike vulgarity too much to find compensation in qualities which are merely amusing. So she ends by adding her own friends, the Kindhearts and the Normans, who go with every one, and a few somewhat younger people, and approves her secretary's suggestions as to additional names if those first invited should regret. The list being settled, Mrs. Worldly's own work is done. She sends word to her cook that there will be 24 on the 10th. The menu will be submitted to her later, which she will probably merely glance at and send back. She never sees or thinks about her table, which is in the butler's province. On the morning of the dinner her secretary brings her the place cards, the name of each person expected written on a separate card, and she puts them in the order in which they are to be placed on the table, very much as though playing solitaire. Starting with her own card at one end and her husband's at the other, she first places the lady of honour on his right, the second in importance on his left. Then, on either side of herself, she puts the 2 most important gentlemen. The others she fits in between, trying to seat side by side those congenial to each other. When the cards are arranged, the secretary attends to putting the name of the lady, who sits on each gentleman's right, in the envelope addressed to him. She then picks up the place cards, still stacked in their proper sequence, and takes them to the butler, who will put them in the order arranged on the table after it is set. 15 minutes before the dinner hour, Mrs. Worldly is already standing in her drawing-room. She has no personal responsibility other than that of being hostess. The whole machinery of equipment and service seemingly runs by itself. It does not matter whether she knows what the menu is. Her cook is more than capable of attending to it. That the table shall be perfect is merely the everyday duty of the butler. She knows without looking that one of the chauffeurs is on the sidewalk, that footmen are in the hall, that her own maid is in the ladies' dressing room, and the valet in that of the gentlemen, and that her butler is just outside the door near which she is standing. So with nothing on her mind, except a jewelled ornament and perfectly done hair, she receives her guests with the tranquillity attained only by those whose household, whether great or small, can be counted on to run like a perfectly coordinated machine. How a dinner can be bungled. This is the contrasting picture to the dinner at the Worldleys, a picture to show you, particularly who are a bride, how awful an experiment in dinner giving can be. Let us suppose that you have a quite charming house, and that your wedding presents included everything necessary to set a well-appointed table. You have not very experienced servants, but they would all be good ones with a little more training. You have been at home for so few meals you don't quite know how experienced they are. Your cook at least makes good coffee and eggs and toast for breakfast, and the few other meals she has cooked seem to be all right, and she is such a nice clean person. So when your house is in order, and the last pictures and curtains are hung, the impulse suddenly comes to you to give a dinner. Your husband thinks it is a splendid idea. It merely remains to decide whom you will ask. You hesitate between a few of your own intimates, or older people, and decide it would be such fun to ask a few of the hostesses whose houses you have almost lived at ever since you came out. You decide to ask Mrs. Toplofty, Mr. Club Window, the Worldleys, the Gildings, and the Kindhearts and the Wellborns. With yourselves, that makes 12. You can't have more than 12 because you have only a dozen of everything. In fact, you decide that 12 will be pretty crowded, but that it will be safe to ask that number because a few are sure to regret. So you write notes, since it is to be a formal dinner, and they all accept. You are a little worried about the size of the dining room, but you are overcome by the feeling of your popularity. Now the thing to do is to prepare for a dinner. The fact that Nora probably can't make fancy dishes does not bother you a bit. In your mind's eye you see delicious plain food passed. You must get Sigrid a dress that properly fits her, and Delia, the chambermaid, who was engaged with the understanding that she was to serve in the dining room when there was company, has not yet been at table, but she is a very willing young person who will surely look well. Nora, when you tell her who are coming, eagerly suggests the sort of menu that would appear on the table of the Worldleys or the Gildings. You are thrilled at the thought of your own kitchen producing the same. That it may be the same in name only does not occur to you. You order flowers for the table, and candy for your 4 compotiers. You pick out your best tablecloth, but you find, rather to your amazement, that when the waitress asks you about setting the table, you have never noticed in detail how the places are laid. Knives and spoons go on the right of the plate, of course, and forks on the left, but which goes next to the plate, or whether the wine glasses should stand nearer or beyond the goblet, you can only guess. It is quite simple, however, to give directions in serving. You just tell the chambermaid that she is to follow the waitress, and pass the sauces and the vegetables. And you have already explained carefully to the latter that she must not deal plates around the table like a pack of cards, or ever take them off in piles either. That much, at least, you do know. You also make it a point, above everything, that the silver must be very clean. Sigrid seems to understand, and with the optimism of youth, you approach the dinner hour without misgiving. The table, set with your wedding silver and glass, looks quite nice. You are a little worried about the silver. It does look rather yellow, but perhaps it is just a shadow. Then you notice there are a great many forks on the table. You ask your husband what is the matter with the forks. He does not see anything wrong. You need them all for the dinner you ordered. How can there be less? So you straighten a candlestick that was out of line, and put the place cards on. Then you go into the drawing-room. You don't light the fire until the last moment, because you want it to be burning brightly when your guests arrive. Your drawing-room looks a little stiff somehow, but an open fire more than anything else makes a room inviting, and you light it just as your first guest rings the bell. As Mr. Club Window enters, the room looks charming. Then suddenly the fire smokes, and in the midst of the smoke your other guests arrive. Everyone begins to cough and blink. They are very polite, but the smoke, growing each moment denser, is not to be overlooked. Mrs. Toplofty takes matters into her own hands, and makes Mr. Doe and your husband carry the logs, smoke and all, and throw them into the yard. The room, still thick with smoke, is now cheerlessly fireless, and another factor beginning to distress you is that, although everyone has arrived, there is no sign of dinner. You wait, at first merely eager to get out of the smoke-filled drawing-room. Gradually you are becoming nervous. What can have happened? The dining-room door might be that of a tomb for all the evidence of life behind it. You become really alarmed. Is dinner never going to be served? Everyone's eyes are red from the smoke, and conversation is getting weaker and weaker. Mrs. Toplofty, evidently despairing, sits down. Mrs. Worldly also sits. Both hold their eyes shut, and say nothing. At last the dining-room door opens, and Sigrid, instead of bowing slightly and saying in a low tone of voice, "Dinner is served," stands stiff as a block of wood, and fairly shouts, "Dinner's all ready!" You hope no one heard her, but you know very well that nothing escaped any one of those present, and between the smoke and the delay, and your waitress's manners, you are already thoroughly mortified by the time you reach the table. But you hope that at least the dinner will be good. For the first time you are assailed with doubt on that score, and again you wait, but the oyster course is all right, and then comes the soup. You don't have to taste it to see that it is wrong. It looks not at all as a clear soup should. Its color, instead of being glass-clear amber, is greasy-looking brown. You taste it, fearing the worst, and the worst is realized. It tastes like dishwater, and is barely tepid. You look around the table. Mr. Kindheart alone is trying to eat it. And removing the plates, Delia, the assistant, takes them up by piling one on top of the other, clashing them together as she does so. You can feel Mrs. Worldly looking with almost hypnotized fascination, as her attention might be drawn to a street accident against her will. Then there is a wait. You wait and wait, and, looking in front of you, you notice the bare tablecloth without a plate. You know instantly that the service is wrong, but you find yourself puzzled to know how it should have been done. Finally Sigrid comes in with a whole dozen plates stacked in a pile, which she proceeds to deal around the table. You at least know that to try and interfere would only make matters worse. You hold your own cold fingers in your lap, knowing that you must sit there, and that you can do nothing. The fish which was to have been a mousse with Hollandaise sauce is a huge mound, much too big for the platter, with a narrow gutter of water around the edge, and the center dabbed over with a curdled yellow mass. You realize that not only is the food itself awful, but that the quantity is too great for one dish. You don't know what to do next. You know there is no use in apologizing, there is no way of dropping through the floor, or waking yourself up. You have collected the smartest and the most critical people around your table, to put them to torture such as they will never forget. Never. You have to bite your lips to keep from crying. Whatever possessed you to ask these people to your horrible house? Mr. Kindheart, sitting next to you, says gently, "Cheer up, little girl, it doesn't really matter." And then you know to the full how terrible the situation is. The meal is endless. Each course is equally unappetizing to look at, and abominably served. You notice that none of your guests eat anything. They can't. You leave the table literally sick, but realizing fully that the giving of a dinner is not as easy as you thought, and in the drawing-room, which is now fireless and freezing, but at least smokeless, you start to apologize, and burst into tears. As you are very young, and those present are all really fond of you, they try to be comforting, but you know that it will be years, if ever, before any of them will be willing to risk an evening in your house again. You also know that without malice, but in truth and frankness, they will tell everyone. Whatever you do, don't wine with the new-weds, unless you eat your dinner before you go, and wear black glasses so no sight can offend you. When they have all gone, you drag yourself miserably upstairs, feeling that you never want to look in that drawing-room or dining-room again. Your husband, remembering the trenches, tries to tell you it was not so bad, but you know. You lie awake planning to let the house, and to discharge each one of your awful household the next morning, and then you realize that the fault is not a bit more theirs than yours. If you had tried the chimney first and learned its peculiarities, if you yourself had known every detail of cooking and service, of course you would not have attempted to give the dinner in the first place. Not at least until, through giving little dinners, the technique of your household had become good enough to give a big one. On the other hand, supposing that you had a very experienced cook and waitress, dinner would, of course, not have been bungled, but it would have lacked something, somewhere, if you added nothing of your own personality to its perfection. It is almost safe to make the statement that no dinner is ever really well done unless the hostess herself knows every smallest detail thoroughly. Mrs. Worldly pays seemingly no attention, but nothing escapes her. She can walk through a room without appearing to look either to the right or left, yet if the slightest detail is amiss, an ornament out of place, or there is one dull button on a footman's livery, her house telephone is rung at once. Having generalized by drawing two pictures, it is now time to take up the specific details to be considered in giving a dinner. Detailed directions for dinner giving. The requisites at every dinner, whether a great one of 200 covers or a little one of 6, are as follows. Guests. People who are congenial to one another. This is of first importance. Food. A suitable menu perfectly prepared and dished. Hot food to be hot, and cold cold. Table furnishing. Faultlessly laundered linen, brilliantly polished silver, and all other table accessories suitable to the occasion and surroundings. Service. Expert dining room servants, and enough of them. Drawing room. Adequate in size to number of guests, and inviting in arrangement. A cordial and hospitable host. A hostess of charm. Charm says everything. Tact, sympathy, poise, and perfect manners, always. And though for all dinners these requisites are much the same, the necessity for perfection increases in proportion to the formality of the occasion. Taste in selection of people. The proper selection of guests is the first essential in all entertaining, and the hostess who has a talent for assembling the right people has a great asset. Taste in house furnishings, or in clothes, or in selecting a cook, is as nothing compared to taste in people. Some people have this sense, others haven't. The first are the great hosts and hostesses, the others are the mediocre or the failures. It is usually a mistake to invite great talkers together. Brilliant men and women who love to talk want hearers, not rivals. Very silent people should be sandwiched between good talkers, or at least voluble talkers. Silly people should never be put anywhere near learned ones, nor the dull near the clever, unless the dull one is a young and pretty woman with a talent for listening, and the clever a man with admiration for beauty and a love for talking. Most people think two brilliant people should be put together. Often they should, but with discretion. If both are voluble or nervous or temperamental, you may create a situation like putting two operatic sopranos in the same part and expecting them to sing together. The endeavor of a hostess, when seating her table, is to put those together who are likely to be interesting to each other. Professor Bug might bore you to tears, but Mrs. Entomoid would probably delight in him, just as Mr. Stockman Bonds and Mrs. Rich would probably have interests in common. Making a dinner list is a little like making a Christmas list. You put down what they will, you hope, like, not what you like. Those who are placed between congenial neighbors remember your dinner as delightful, even though both food and service were mediocre. But ask people out of their own groups and seat them next to their pet aversions, and wild horses could not drag them to your house again. How a dinner list is kept. Nearly every hostess keeps a dinner list, apart from her general visiting list, of people with whom she is accustomed to dine, or to invite to dinners or other small entertainments. But the prominent hostess, if she has grown daughters and continually gives parties of all sorts and sizes and ages, usually keeps her list in a more complete and ready reference order. Mrs. Gilding, for instance, has guest lists separately indexed. Under the general heading Dinners she has Older Married, Younger Married, Girls, Men. Her luncheon list is taken from her dinner list. Bridge includes especially good players of all ages. Dances, young married people, young girls, and dancing men. Then she has a cross-index list of important persons, meaning those of real distinction who are always the foundation of all good society. Amusing, usually people of talent, invaluable for house parties, and new people, including many varieties and unassorted. Mrs. Gilding exchanges invitations with a number of these because they are interesting or amusing, or because their parties are diverting and dazzling; and Mrs. Gilding herself, being typical of New York's cavalier element rather than its Puritan strain, personally prefers diversion to edification. Needless to say, Boston's best, being 98% Puritan, has no new list. Beside her list of new people, she has a short, frivolous list of other cavaliers like herself, and a neutral list, which is the most valuable of all, because it compromises those who go with everyone. Beside her own lists she has a pantry list, a list that is actually made out for the benefit of the butler, so that on occasions he can invite guests to fill in. The pantry list comprises only intimate friends who belong on the neutral list, and fit in everywhere, young girls, and young and older single men. Allowing the butler to invite guests at his own discretion is not quite as casual as it sounds. It is very often an unavoidable expedient. For instance, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mr. Blank telephones that he cannot come to dinner that same evening. Mrs. Gilding is out. To wait until she returns will make it too late to fill the place. Her butler, who has been with her for years, knows quite as well as Mrs. Gilding herself exactly which people belong in the same group. The dinner cards being already in his possession, he can see not only who is expected for dinner, but the two ladies between whom Mr. Blank has been placed, and he thereupon selects some one of the pantry list who is suitable for Mr. Blank's place at the table, and telephones the invitation. Perhaps he calls up a dozen before he finds one disengaged. When Mrs. Gilding returns, he says, "Mr. Blank telephoned he would not be able to come for dinner, as he was called to Washington. Mr. Batchelor will be happy to come in his place." Married people are seldom on this list, because the butler need not undertake to fill any but an odd place, that of a gentleman particularly; otherwise two ladies would be seated together. Asking some one to fill a place. Since no one but a fairly intimate friend is ever asked to fill a place, this invitation is always telephoned. A very young man is asked by the butler if he will dine with Mrs. Gilding that evening, and very likely no explanation is made. But if the person to be invited is a lady, or an older gentleman, except on such occasions as noted above, the hostess herself telephones. "Can you do me a great favor, and fill a place at dinner tonight?" The one who receives this invitation is rather bound by the rules of good manners to accept if possible. End of Chapter 14, Part 1.